Chapter 16 of Recollections of Abraham Lincoln, 1847 to 1865, by Ward Hill Lamon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 16 Conflict between Civil and Military Authority. The execution of the Fugitive Slave Law in the District of Columbia became a question much discussed in Congress, and was a frightful scandal to the radical members. The law remained in force, and no attempt was made by Congress to repeal it, or to provide for the protection of the executive officers whose duty it was to enforce it. The subject gave Mr. Lincoln great concern, but he could see no way out of the difficulty except to have the law executed. The district had become the asylum of the runaway slaves from the border states, particularly from the rebel state of Virginia and the quasi-loyal state of Maryland. So far as the state of Virginia was concerned, she was still, according to the theory of the administration, one of the United States, and all congressional laws on the statute book were enforced in regard to her as well as to states not in rebellion, which made the question one of great embarrassment. The Confiscation Act, which gave liberty to all slaves that had been employed by the rebels for insurrectionary purposes, had gone into effect in the month of August, 1861. The military governor of the district assumed that by virtue of this law all slaves that came into the district from whatever section had been thus employed, and consequently were free, and it became his duty to give them military protection as free persons. This state of things caused a fearful responsibility to rest upon the shoulders of the civil executive authorities. The President gave me private instructions to execute the laws until Congress modified or repealed them. "In doing this," Mr. Lincoln said, "you will receive much adverse criticism, and a good deal of downright abuse from members of Congress. This is certain to come, but it will be not so much intended for you as for me. As our friend Senator Hale the other day said in the Senate, we must not strike too high nor too low, but we must strike between wind and water. The marshal is the man to hit. And I say we shall have to stand it whatever they send." Martial law had not been declared. There was not even a temporary suspension of the civil authority, even in exceptional cases, in the District of Columbia. It was conceded by all that in time of danger the temporary rule of military authority was virtually necessary to the preservation of the Federal capital. But at this time there was no pretense of danger. The civil courts of the district, being in full power for the adjudication of all cases arising within their jurisdiction, nothing but a pressing military necessity could give countenance or pretext for the suspension of the civil law. It was therefore only a question of time, and the time soon came, for a conflict to arise between civil and military authority. The conflict grew out of an order of the military governor to take a female fugitive slave from the custody of the marshal and deliver her into the hands of the military. The deputies to whom the order was shown declined to obey the command, giving as a reason for their refusal that she was held under due process of law, and that they had no authority to give her up without the order of the court. Military officers with a strong guard then arrested the deputy marshals, seized the jail, released the slave, and left a military guard in charge of the captured jail. I was temporarily absent at the time of the seizure. When I returned I arrested the military guard, recaptured the jail, liberated the prisoners placed therein by the military, and held the military guard as prisoners. I was supported by the police and other civil authorities, and by the citizens of Washington. The military governor was supported by forces under his command, intended for the defense of the city. The matter was eventually laid before the President. He called to his aid his Attorney General, who gave a prompt but decisive opinion that in the present state of things in the District of Columbia the civil authority outranked the military, and he gave the further opinion that the military governor's conduct had been misguided and unauthorized, however philanthropic might have been his purposes and intentions. This decision on the subject of supremacy of authority by no means reconciled or put at rest the perturbed, aggressive spirit in Congress which opposed the President's policy. The enthusiastic adherents of this opposition made the district jail an objective point in the furtherance of their ends. They made personal visits to that institution and examined all the inmates whose color was not of orthodox albino Anglo-American tint. They would learn the story of their wrongs and injuries, then straightway proceed to the halls of Congress and make known their discoveries. Detectives were employed by them to make daily reports of the cruelty shown to colored inmates of the jail, which reports were soon dressed up in pathetic and classic language for the occasion. Professional and amateur demagogues made sensational speeches, sometimes written for them by department clerks and professional speechwriters, and Rome was made to howl in the halls of the American Congress. Lincoln and his beastly negro catchers were denounced in unmeasured terms. The jail was now by the necessities of its surroundings made the receptacle for prisoners of all kinds, civil, military, and state. Orders from the War Department were issued to the custodian of the jail to allow no person whatever to communicate with the military or state prisoners without an order from the War Department. The chairman of the district committee in the Senate, and certain others of that committee, claimed the right, by virtue of their position, to go into the jail and to examine all the prisoners, in the face of the orders of the Secretary of War, and this was repeated almost daily. The situation became unbearable, and I sent in my resignation. This, however, was not accepted. The professional opinion of the Attorney General was again invoked by the President, and he gave his views as to the duties of the custodian of the heterogeneous mass of prisoners in the jail, which resulted in the request of the President to the Attorney General to prepare such an order as was proper for the Marshal to sign, giving notice of what would be required for admission of visitors to the jail. The paper was prepared in the Attorney General's office, signed and sent forth, and before the close of the day on which it was signed, resolutions were passed in Congress declaring the Marshal guilty of contempt of that body for having presumed to issue what it deemed a contemptuous restriction of its rights, and a committee was appointed to wait upon the President to demand the instant dismissal of that insolent officer. The President showed the committee my resignation already in his hands, and informed them that he would neither accept the resignation nor dismiss me from office, and gave his reasons for this action. After this the opposition became more and more acrimonious and offensive toward Mr. Lincoln and his administration. The leaders of the opposition now resorted to every means in their power to oppose him for his want of respect and for his disobedience to the behests of the coordinate branch of the government, forgetting that, Congress having made the offensive laws, it was the President's duty to execute them. Soon the Marshal's office was made the subject of legislation in Congress, to shear it of its power and reduce its emoluments. The custody of the jail and prisoners was soon given to a warden, and shortly after an act was passed relieving the Marshal from the duties of attending the Supreme Court of the United States, and providing a special Marshal for that court, thus leaving the office still one of great responsibility, but without remuneration commensurate with its duties. Before the appointment of the warden, the district court had sentenced 3 men to be hanged for murder, on a day subsequent to the change of custody. On the day set for the execution, I refused to act as the hangman. Congress again passed a resolution denouncing my conduct, and instituted an investigation into the facts. The facts were that the order of the court was that the Marshal should hang the condemned men, but Congress had unconsciously relieved him from that painful duty. The warden had no order for their execution, and could not perform the service with any more propriety than the Marshal. The result of this blundering legislation, superinduced by hasty, factious zeal to injure an object of their dislike, was that Congress had nullified the solemn acts of the United States District Court, and restored to life and liberty and immunity from punishment 3 miscreants whose lives had been forfeited and who should have been hanged. The legislative jail delivery was a source of great annoyance and of some amusement to Mr. Lincoln. In speaking of certain members of Congress and the part they had taken in this and other petty acts, he said, "I have great sympathy for these men, because of their temper and their weakness, but I am thankful that the good Lord has given to the vicious ox short horns, for if their physical courage were equal to their vicious dispositions some of us in this neck of the woods would get hurt." The opposition was continued to the last, and Mr. Lincoln adhered to his policy to the end. But he was so outraged by the obloquy thrown upon his worthiest official acts, so stung by the disparagement with which his purest and most patriotic motives were impugned, his existence, in a word, was rendered so unhappy by the personal as well as political attacks of those for whose sympathy and support he might naturally have urged the most logical and valid plea, that life became almost a burden to him. As illustrative of the amenities of language with which, at this epoch of his life, the chief magistrate of our republic was habitually characterized, it will suffice to adduce such an expression as this: "That hideous baboon at the other end of the avenue, whom Barnum should exhibit as a zoological curiosity." Mr. Lincoln's existence was so cruelly embittered by these and other expressions quite as virulent, that I have often heard him declare, "I would rather be dead than as President thus abused in the house of my friends." In the summer of 1861, shortly after the inglorious repulse of the Union army at Bull Run, Rev. Robert Collier, the eminent divine, was on a visit to the Federal capital. Participating in the prevailing sentiment in regard to the incapacity or inefficiency of the general government in the conduct of military affairs, he chanced to pass through the White House grounds on his way to the War Department. Casting a cursory glance at the Executive Mansion as he passed, his attention was suddenly arrested by the apparition of 3 pairs of feet resting on the ledge of an open window in one of the apartments of the second story, and plainly visible from below. The reverend gentleman paused, calmly surveyed the grotesque spectacle, and mentally addressed to himself the inquiry whether the feet and boots belonging to them were the property of officers of the executive government, at the same time thinking that if not they would have proved sturdy pedestals to the bearers of muskets upon the recent battlefield. Resuming his walk, he accosted a rustic employee whom he found at work about the grounds, and pointed to the window with its incongruous adjuncts. He requested of the man what that meant. "Why, you old fool," replied the rustic, "that's the cabinet that is a settin', and them dar big feet's old Abe's." Some time after, in referring to this experience of his visit to the national capital in a lecture at Boston, the reverend gentleman commented on the imbecility of the government, and satirically added, "That's about all they are good for in Washington, to project their feet out of windows and jabber away, but they go nowhere and accomplish nothing." But he subsequently, on more than one occasion, rendered full justice to the President's able and zealous discharge of his high trust, saying, "I abused poor Lincoln, like the fool that the rustic called me, while his heart was even then breaking with the anxieties and responsibilities of his position." End of Chapter 16. Conflict between Civil and Military Authority. Read by John Greenman. Chapter 17 of Recollections of Abraham Lincoln, 1847 to 1865, by Ward Hill Lamon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 17. Plots and Assassination. The fact that we have in this country a literature of assassination, voluminous and vast, suggests a melancholy reflection on the disordered spirit of the times through which we have passed, and on the woeful perversity of human nature even under conditions most favorable to intellectual progress and Christian civilization. It is hurtful to our pride as Americans to confess that our history is marred by records so repugnant to the spirit of our liberal institutions and to the good fellowship which ought to characterize both individual and national life in a free republic. but the appalling fact remains that two of our chief magistrates, within as many decades, were murdered in cold blood, and that bulky volumes have been filled with circumstantial accounts of plots and conspiracies by and against men born upon our soil and enjoying the full protection of our laws. And yet, voluminous and extensive as these records are, they are by no means complete. One most daring attempt upon the life of Mr. Lincoln, the boldest of all attempts of that character, and one which approached shockingly near to a murderous success, was never made public. For prudential reasons details were withheld from the press, but as the motives which imposed silence respecting a strange freak of homicidal frenzy no longer exist, it is perhaps a matter of duty to make public the story, together with certain documents which show in what deadly peril Mr. Lincoln stood during the ceremonies attending his second inauguration at the Capitol in March, 1865. A glance at prior conspiracies will lead to a better understanding of the event to which these documents relate. The first conspiracy, from motives of policy, had for its object the abduction of President Buchanan. There was intense disgust on the part of certain fiery and ferocious leaders in the secession movement with the conservative temper of the executive and of the ruling members of his cabinet. After fruitless attempts to bully the administration into a change of policy in harmony with his revolutionary scheme, Mr. Wigfall, sometime in the month of December, 1860, formed a plan for kidnapping Mr. Buchanan. A number of desperate men were banded together by him at Washington, and the details of the plot were discussed and agreed upon. The plan was to spirit Mr. Buchanan away, install Mr. Breckinridge in the White House, and hold the captive President as a hostage until terms of compromise could be proposed to conservative Democrats and Republicans in the North. Mr. Wigfall and other choice spirits had no doubt that their plan of accommodation could be enforced through the ad interim executive. The scheme, however, could not be executed in its first stage without the concurrence and cooperation of Mr. Floyd, who threw Wigfall into a paroxysm of explosive wrath by flatly refusing to have anything to do with the enterprise. It was accordingly abandoned so far as Mr. Buchanan was concerned. When Mr. Lincoln was inaugurated in March, 1861, the organization of plotters was still intact, but no plan of assassination had as yet received the sanction of the conspirators as a body. It was their purpose to kidnap Mr. Lincoln and hold him in captivity without injury to his person until such concessions were made to the Southern leaders as their plan of compromise rendered necessary. This second scheme of abduction, having proved as abortive as the first, was abandoned in favor of a more deadly purpose. Some of the more desperate among the conspirators, exasperated by repeated failures, resolved to dispose of Mr. Lincoln by the swifter and surer means afforded by the dagger or the bullet. Circumstances, in a surprising way, seemed to favor their murderous designs. Against the protest of his friends, who by detective means had obtained from the plotters many of their secrets, Mr. Lincoln made the Soldiers' Home his summer residence. The conspirators thought that either abduction or assassination could be accomplished without difficulty. They resolved upon the latter. They would dispatch him during one of his lonely rides after nightfall from the White House to his summer retreat. The attempt was made. In the spring and early summer of 1862 I persistently urged upon Mr. Lincoln the necessity of a military escort to accompany him to and from his residence and place of business, and he as persistently opposed my proposition, always saying, when the subject was referred to, that there was not the slightest occasion for such precaution. One morning, however, in the month of August, he came riding up to the White House steps, where I met him, with a merry twinkle in his eye that presaged fun of some kind. Before he alighted he said, "I have something to tell you," and after we had entered his office he locked the doors, sat down, and commenced his narration. At this distance of time I will not pretend to give the exact words of this interview, but will state it according to my best recollection. He said:
You know, I have always told you I thought you an idiot that ought to be put in a straitjacket for your apprehensions of my personal danger from assassination. You also know that the way we skulked into this city in the first place has been a source of shame and regret to me, for it did look so cowardly." To all of which I simply assented, saying, "Yes, go on." "Well," said he, "I don't now propose to make you my father confessor and acknowledge a change of heart, yet I am free to admit that just now I don't know what to think. I am staggered. Understand me, I do not want to oppose my pride of opinion against light and reason, but I am in such a state of betweenity in my conclusions that I can't say that the judgment of this court is prepared to proclaim a reliable decision upon the facts presented." He paused. I requested him to go on, for I was in painful suspense. He then proceeded: "Last night, about 11 o'clock, I went out to the Soldiers' Home alone, riding Old Abe, as you call him," a horse he delighted in riding, "and when I arrived at the foot of the hill on the road leading to the entrance of the home grounds, I was jogging along at a slow gait, immersed in deep thought, contemplating what was next to happen in the unsettled state of affairs, when suddenly I was aroused. I may say the arousement lifted me out of my saddle as well as out of my wits, by the report of a rifle, and seemingly the gunner was not 50 yards from where my contemplations ended and my accelerated transit began. My erratic namesake, with little warning, gave proof of decided dissatisfaction at the racket, and with one reckless bound he unceremoniously separated me from my $8 plug hat, with which I parted company without any assent, expressed or implied, upon my part. At a breakneck speed we soon arrived in a haven of safety. Meanwhile I was left in doubt whether death was more desirable from being thrown from a runaway Federal horse, or as the tragic result of a rifle ball fired by a disloyal bushwhacker in the middle of the night." This was all told in a spirit of levity. He seemed unwilling even in appearance to attach that importance to the event which I was disposed to give to it. He seemed to want to believe it a joke. "Now," said he, "in the face of this testimony in favor of your theory of danger to me personally, I can't bring myself to believe that any one has shot or will deliberately shoot at me with the purpose of killing me, although I must acknowledge that I heard this fellow's bullet whistle at an uncomfortably short distance from these headquarters of mine. I have about concluded that the shot was the result of accident. It may be that someone on his return from a day's hunt, regardless of the course of his discharge, fired off his gun as a precautionary measure of safety to his family after reaching his house." This was said with much seriousness. He then playfully proceeded: "I tell you there is no time on record equal to that made by the two Old Abes on that occasion. The historic ride of John Gilpin, and Henry Wilson's memorable display of a bareback equestrianship on the stray army mule from the scenes of the Battle of Bull Run a year ago, are nothing in comparison to mine, either in point of time made or in ludicrous pageantry. My only advantage over these worthies was in having no observers. I can truthfully say that one of the Abes was frightened on this occasion, but modesty forbids my mentioning which of us is entitled to that distinguished honor. This whole thing seems farcical. No good can result at this time from giving it publicity. It does seem to me that I am in more danger from the augmentation of imaginary peril than from a judicious silence, be the danger ever so great, and moreover I do not want it understood that I share your apprehensions. I never have."
At this time Mr. Lincoln was to me a study. It would seem that he was always prepared for the inevitable, and singularly indifferent as to his personal safety. He was then still suffering from his terrible domestic affliction, the death of his favorite son Willie. He doubtless at times acted an unnatural part in his endeavors to banish from his memory the disturbing recollections of his lost idol. I often recur with mingled feelings of admiration and sadness to the wonderful simplicity and perfect faith exemplified in his narration of the hazardous experience above described. He said: "I am determined to borrow no trouble. I believe in the right, and that it will ultimately prevail. And I believe it is the inalienable right of man, unimpaired even by this dreadful distraction of our country, to be happy or miserable at his own election, and I for one make choice of the former alternative." "Yes," said I, "but it is a devil of a poor protection against a shotgun in time of war, for that fellow on the roadside last night was just such a philosopher as yourself, although acting from a different standpoint. He exercised one of his supposed inalienable rights to make himself happy and the country miserable by attempting to kill you, and unless you are more careful and discreet, and will be governed by wiser counsels than you derive from your own obstinate persistency and recklessness, in less than a week you'll have neither inalienable nor any other rights, and we shall have no Lincoln. The time, I fear, may not be far distant when this republic will be minus a pretty respectable president." It was impossible, however, to induce him to forego these lonely and dangerous journeys between the Executive Mansion and the Soldiers' Home. A stranger to fear, he often eluded our vigilance, and before his absence could be noted he would be well on his way to his summer residence, alone, and many times at night. Another occasion when the vigilance and anxiety of his friends were exercised will appear in the following extract from a memorandum written by Robert Lamon, who was Deputy Marshal of the District of Columbia at the time. "In the early part of the night my brother came to me and asked me to join him in the search for Mr. Lincoln. He was greatly disturbed. We drove rapidly to the Soldiers' Home, and as we neared the entrance to the grounds we met a carriage. Behind it we could see in the darkness a man on horseback. My brother, who seemed unusually suspicious, commanded the party to halt. His order was instantly obeyed. "Who are you?" he demanded, in the same peremptory tone. A voice from within the carriage responded, "Why do you ask?" The speakers recognized each other. The one in the carriage was Secretary Stanton, and the man behind it was one of his orderlies. "Where is Mr. Lincoln?" asked Stanton. "I have been to the Soldiers' Home, and he is not there. I am exceedingly uneasy about him. He is not at the White House?" "No," said my brother, "he is not there. I have looked for him everywhere." We hurried back to the city. Arriving at the White House before Mr. Stanton, we found Mr. Lincoln walking across the lawn. My brother went with him to the War Department, and from there took him to his Lamon's house, where Mr. Lincoln slept that night and the 3 or 4 nights following, Mrs. Lincoln being at that time in New York. Signed, Robert Lamon. My anxiety about Mr. Lincoln that evening grew out of a report of an alarming character made to me by one of my detectives. Stanton had threatening news also, and was therefore excited about Mr. Lincoln's safety. He told me that he never had so great a scare in his life as he had that night. The brusque secretary thought the deputy marshal and I were assassins. The incident provoked much merriment among the parties concerned, no one enjoying the serio-comic part of it more than Mr. Lincoln himself. Meanwhile the conspirators, becoming alarmed for their own safety, observed a stricter caution. Their movements were embarrassed by the escort of cavalry, which Mr. Lincoln was finally induced to accept, after prolonged importunities by those who had certain knowledge of the dangers to which he was exposed. Lost opportunities, baffled hopes, exasperating defeats served, however, only to heighten the deadly determination of the plotters, and so matters drifted on until the day of Mr. Lincoln's second inauguration. A tragedy was planned for that day which has no parallel in the history of criminal audacity, if considered as nothing more than a crime intended. Everybody knows what throngs assemble at the Capitol to witness the imposing ceremonies attending the inauguration of a President of the United States. It is amazing that any human being could have seriously entertained the thought of assassinating Mr. Lincoln in the presence of such a concourse of citizens, and yet there was such a man in the assemblage. He was there for the single purpose of murdering the illustrious leader who for the second time was about to assume the burden of the presidency. That man was John Wilkes Booth. Proof of his identity, and a detailed account of his movements while attempting to reach the platform where Mr. Lincoln stood, will be found in many affidavits, of which the following is a specimen: District of Columbia, County of Washington, SS. Robert Strong, a citizen of said county and district, being duly sworn, says that he was a policeman at the Capitol on the day of the second inauguration of President Lincoln, and was stationed at the east door of the rotunda with Commissioner B. French at the time the President, accompanied by the judges and others, passed out to the platform where the ceremonies of inauguration were about to begin, when a man in a very determined and excited manner broke through the line of policemen which had been formed to keep the crowd out. Lieutenant Westfall immediately seized the stranger, and a considerable scuffle ensued. The stranger seemed determined to get to the platform where the President and his party were, but Lieutenant Westfall called for assistance. The Commissioner closed the door, or had it closed, and the intruder was finally thrust from the passage leading to the platform, which was reserved for the President's party. After the President was assassinated, the singular conduct of this stranger on that day was frequently talked of by the policemen who observed it. Lieutenant Westfall procured a photograph of the assassin Booth soon after the death of the President, and showed it to Commissioner French in my presence and in the presence of several other policemen, and asked him if he had ever met that man. The Commissioner examined it attentively and said, "Yes, I would know that face among 10,000. That is the man you had a scuffle with on Inauguration Day. That is the same man." Affiant also recognized the photograph. Lieutenant Westfall then said, "This is the picture of J. Wilkes Booth." Major French exclaimed, "My God, what a fearful risk we ran that day!" Robert Strong. Sworn to and subscribed before me this 20th day of March, 1876. James A. Tate, Notary Public. Seal. From this sworn statement it will be seen that Booth's plan was one of phenomenal audacity. So frenzied was the homicide that he determined to take the President's life at the inevitable sacrifice of his own, for nothing can be more certain than that the murder of Mr. Lincoln on that public occasion, in the presence of a vast concourse of admiring citizens, would have been instantly avenged. The infuriated populace would have torn the assassin to pieces, and this the desperate man doubtless knew. It is a curious fact that, although Mr. Lincoln believed that his career would be cut short by violence, he was incorrigibly skeptical as to the agency in the expected tragedy, with one solitary exception. Elderly residents of Washington will remember one Gurowski, a Polish exile, as many believed. He was an accomplished linguist, a revolutionist by nature, restless, revengeful, and of a fiery and ungovernable temper. He had been employed in the State Department as a translator, I believe, but had quarreled with Mr. Seward and was discharged. This caused him to pursue Lincoln, Seward, and Sumner with bitter hatred. The curious will find in a published diary of his a fantastic classification of his enemies. The President he rated as third class, according to his estimate of statesmanlike qualities. From this man Gurowski, and from him alone, Mr. Lincoln really apprehended danger by a violent assault, although he knew not what the sense of fear was like. Mr. Lincoln more than once said to me, "So far as my personal safety is concerned, Gurowski is the only man who has given me a serious thought of a personal nature.
From the known disposition of the man, he is dangerous, wherever he may be. I have sometimes thought that he might try to take my life. It would be just like him to do such a thing." The following letter was written one night when I was much annoyed at what seemed to me Mr. Lincoln's carelessness in this matter: "Washington, D.C., December 10, 1864, 1:30 o'clock A.M. "Hon. A. Lincoln: Sir, I regret that you do not appreciate what I have repeatedly said to you in regard to the proper police arrangements connected with your household and your own personal safety. You are in danger. I have nothing to ask, and I flatter myself that you will at least believe that I am honest. If, however, you have been impressed differently, do me and the country the justice to dispose at once of all suspected officers and accept my resignation of the marshalship, which is hereby tendered. I will give you further reasons which have impelled me to this course. Tonight, as you have done on several previous occasions, you went unattended to the theater. When I say unattended, I mean that you went alone with Charles Sumner and a foreign minister, neither of whom could defend himself against an assault from any able-bodied woman in this city. And you know, or ought to know, that your life is sought after, and will be taken unless you and your friends are cautious. For you have many enemies within our lines. You certainly know that I have provided men at your mansion to perform all necessary police duty, and I am always ready myself to perform any duty that will properly conduce to your interest or your safety. God knows that I am unselfish in this matter, and I do think that I have played low comedy long enough, and at my time of life I think I ought at least to attempt to play star engagements. I have the honor to be your obedient servant, Ward H. Lamon." Mr. Lincoln had in his great heart no place for uncharitableness or suspicion, which accounts for his singular indifference to the numberless cautions so earnestly and persistently pressed upon him by friends who knew the danger to which he was hourly exposed. He had a sublime faith in human nature, and in that faith he lived until the fatal moment when the nations of the earth were startled by a tragedy whose mournful consequences no man can measure. An unwonted interest attaches to the assassination of Mr. Lincoln, not alone from the peculiarly dramatic incidents by which it was attended, but also from the controlling influence he would unquestionably have exerted, if his life had been spared, in modifying and facilitating the solution of perhaps the greatest social and political problem of our modern times. This problem, after being committed to the solemn arbitrament of the sword and passing through its ordeal, had now reached an ulterior stage of development which demanded, in the council chamber, the exercise of even higher administrative qualities than those which had hitherto directed its general conduct in the field. These attributes, it was generally recognized and conceded, were possessed by Mr. Lincoln in a preeminent degree. To a constancy of purpose and tenacity of will, of which conspicuous evidence had been presented in the final triumph of the Union cause, he united a conciliatory disposition and the gentleness, sensibility, and simplicity of a child. Frequent reference has already been made to the humane and generous promptings of Mr. Lincoln's great soul in all the varied relations of his life, as well as private as official, and to instances of patriotism and of self-sacrifice almost unparalleled in the annals of history. With a more enlarged experience of the violence of party passion and of internecine strife, and of the excesses to which they sometimes unhappily lead, it seems almost incredible that the apprehensions of danger to Mr. Lincoln should have been shared by so few, when one thinks of the simplicity of his domestic habits, the facilities at all times afforded for a near approach to his presence, and the entire absence of all safeguards for the protection of his person, save the watchfulness of one or two of his most immediate friends. And this, too, at a period of such unprecedented party excitement and sectional strife and animosity.
But the truth is, the crime of assassination was so abhorrent to the genius of Anglo Saxon civilization, so foreign to the spirit and practice of our republican institutions, that little danger was apprehended of an outrage against society at large, the recollection of which even now suffices to tinge with a blush of shame the cheek of every true American, whether of Northern or of Southern birth. In 1880, after the nomination of General Garfield for President, General Grant visited Boulder, Colorado, where I was at that time residing. We had a long conversation on the assassination of Mr. Lincoln, and he told me that about the period of the surrender of General Lee no subject gave him deeper concern than the personal safety of the President. He stated that while no special cause existed for this apprehension, as the war was manifestly and inevitably drawing to a conclusion, he had been harassed by almost constant fears and anxieties for Mr. Lincoln's life. "I learned," said he, "that your own apprehensions were excited from the very outbreak of the war, in fact before the war was declared. It seems unaccountable to me now, in reviewing the situation, that more persons were not so impressed. I was aware, during all the latter part of the war, of your own fears, and of what you had done and were doing for his safety and protection." I read a communication addressed to the St. Louis Democrat in July, 1886, by Mr. R. C. Laverty, General Grant's telegraph operator, in which he states that at the time of the surrender General Grant reported every day regularly to Washington, and was in constant communication at that time with the capital, because he was extremely anxious about the personal safety of the President. Upon the assassination of Mr. Lincoln being communicated to General Grant, he exclaimed, "This is the darkest day of my life. I do not know what it means. Here was the rebellion put down in the field, and it is reasserting itself in the gutter. We had fought it as war. We have now to fight it as murder." Continuing his observations, he said, "I was busy sending off orders to stop recruiting and the purchase of supplies, and to muster out the army. Mr. Lincoln had promised to go to the theater that evening, and wanted me to accompany him. While I was with the President a note was received by me from Mrs. Grant, saying that she was desirous of leaving Washington on the same evening on a visit to her daughter at Burlington. Some incidents of a trivial character had influenced this determination, and she decided to leave by an evening train. I was not disinclined to meet her wishes, not caring particularly to go to the theater. I therefore made my excuses to the President, and at the hour determined upon we left home for the railway station. As we were driving along Pennsylvania Avenue a horseman rode rapidly past us at a gallop, and, wheeling his horse, rode back, peering into our carriage as he again passed us. Mrs. Grant, with a perceptible shade of concern in her voice and manner, remarked to me, "That is the very man who sat near us at lunch to day with some others, and tried to overhear our conversation. He was so rude, you remember, as to cause us to leave the dining room. Here he is again riding after us." For myself, I thought it was only idle curiosity, but learned afterward that the horseman was Booth. It seemed that I was also to have been attacked, and Mrs. Grant's sudden determination to leave Washington deranged the plan. Only a few days afterwards I received an anonymous letter stating that the writer had been detailed to assassinate me, that he rode in my train as far as Havre de Grace, and as my car was locked he failed to get in. He now thanked God he had so failed. I remember very well that the conductor locked our car door, but how far the letter was genuine I was unable to say. I was advised of the assassination of Mr. Lincoln in passing through Philadelphia, and immediately returned to Washington by a special train. When the dreadful tragedy occurred I was out of the city, having gone to Richmond 2 days before on business for Mr. Lincoln connected with the call of a convention for Reconstruction, about which there had arisen some complications. I have preserved the pass Mr. Lincoln gave me to go through to Richmond, of which the following is a facsimile: "Allow the bearer, Mr. H. Lamon, and friend, with ordinary baggage, to pass from Washington to Richmond and return. A. Lincoln, April 11, 1865." This was perhaps the last passport ever written or authorized by Abraham Lincoln. On the eve of my departure I urged upon Mr. Usher, the Secretary of the Interior, to persuade Mr. Lincoln to exercise extreme caution, and to go out as little as possible while I was absent. Mr. Usher went with me to see Mr. Lincoln, and when about to leave I asked him if he would make me a promise. He asked what it was, and said that he thought he could venture to say he would. I wanted him to promise me that he would not go out after night while I was gone, particularly to the theater. He turned to Mr. Usher and said: "Usher, this boy is a monomaniac on the subject of my safety. I can hear him or hear of his being around at all times of the night to prevent somebody from murdering me. He thinks I shall be killed, and we think he is going crazy." He then added: "What does anyone want to assassinate me for? If anyone wants to do so, he can do it any day or night, if he is ready to give his life for mine. It is nonsense." Mr. Usher then said: "Mr. Lincoln, it is well to listen and give heed to Lemon. He is thrown among people that give him opportunities to know more about such matters than we can know." I then renewed my request, standing with my hat in my hand, ready to start. "Well," said Mr. Lincoln, "I promise to do the best I can towards it." He then shook me cordially by the hand and said: "Good by, and God bless you, Hill." This was the last time I ever saw my friend. April 14. Mr. Lincoln, accompanied by his wife, Miss Harris, and Major Rathbone, of Albany, New York, was accompanying a box at Ford's Theater, in the city of Washington. The play was Our American Cousin, with the elder Southern in the principal role. Mr. Lincoln was enjoying it greatly. Lee had surrendered on the 9th. On the 13th the war was everywhere regarded as ended, and upon that day Secretary Stanton had telegraphed to General Dix, Governor of New York, requesting him to stop the draft. Southern, as Lord Dundreary, was at his best. Lincoln was delighted. The lines which care and responsibility had so deeply graven on his brow were now scarcely visible. His people had just passed through the greatest civil war known in the history of nations, and he had become well convinced that now, the cause of strife being destroyed, the government over which he was ruling would be made stronger, greater, and better by the crucial test through which it has passed. Before leaving for the theater he had pronounced it the happiest day of his life. He looked, indeed, as if he now fully realized the consummation of the long cherished and fondest aspiration of his heart. He was at length the undisputed chief magistrate of a confederation of states, constituting the freest and most powerful commonwealth of modern times. At some part of the performance Southern appeared on the stage with Miss Meredith, the heroine, on one arm, and a wrap or shawl carelessly thrown over the other. The latter seats herself upon a garden lounge placed on the stage near the box occupied by the President on this occasion. Lord Dundreary retires a few paces distant from the rustic seat when Miss Meredith, glancing languidly at his lordship, exclaims: "My lord, will you kindly throw my shawl over my shoulders? There appears to be a draught here." Southern, at once complying with her request, advanced with the mincing step that immortalized him, and with a merry twinkle of the eye, and a significant glance directed at Mr. Lincoln, responded in the happy impromptu: "You are mistaken, Miss Mary. The draft has already been stopped by order of the President." This sally caused Mr. Lincoln to laugh as few except himself could laugh, and an outburst of merriment resounded from all parts of the house. It was Mr. Lincoln's last laugh. End of Chapter 17, Plots and Assassination, and end of Recollections of Abraham Lincoln, 1847 to 1865, by Ward Hill Lamon. Read by John Greenman.